August 17th through the 24th, I'm going to be at the Feathered Pipe Ranch in Helena, Montana. And I want to tell you about it because the Feathered Pipe is a truly magical place. I've been there a few times before. I've talked about it on the show before. The founder, India Sapira, has been here on the show. And if you enjoy the kind of inquiry that happens here and you're interested in engaging in that kind of inquiry with me in person, this time at the Feathered Pipe is really an ideal place to do it. You know, a lot of times these days I do one-off workshops or 2-day intensives. I rarely get an opportunity to do a full-length program like this. 7 days in the most incredible setting you could imagine. There's just no better formula for some deep exchange and learning. I'm looking forward to it, and it would be very cool if you were to join me. It's the Feathered Pipe Ranch, August 17th through the 24th in Helena, Montana. You can find out the details and learn about all my in-person teachings at jbrownyoga.com. All right, how about it? We both just hit a button, and now we are in the same space together, regardless of time or location. It's a crazy thing, isn't it? This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown, and I am very grateful that you have chosen to listen. Welcome to anybody who's new, and thanks to everybody else. How's everybody doing? I'm home. I'm back. I'm back in the States. It was quite a leap home and quite a recovery, but I'm happy to say I'm feeling back to myself again. And I am coming to you today on my birthday. I am recording on my 47th birthday. This will actually be released in another day or two, but right now, it is the end of the day in which I was born 47 years ago. And it was most certainly a very reflective day for me. I don't know why, but I got up in the morning and I went up into the attic and I pulled out this suitcase that I have, which is where I keep all of the little trinkets and papers and photos and things that I felt were too significant to throw out over the years, which is not that much, frankly. I've had a ritual of throwing things out over the years. Maybe some things I probably shouldn't have thrown out, frankly, because I didn't want to have attachment to stuff. But there were some things, you know, photos of me with old girlfriends, and what else did I look at? I looked at the handwritten journals that I did when I was traveling in India in 1998. And it's just amazing. What a trip, you know? What a trip. The way our lives unfold. And then I went with my family, my wife and 2 daughters, and we played 18 holes of mini golf. And I don't know that any of you would know this about me, but there was a time in my life where golf was a regular practice of mine. I really enjoy that game. Before I had children, I would go quite a bit. But once we had kids, it was almost like I couldn't justify the money and time anymore. And I literally haven't been on a golf course in almost a decade now, I believe. I think I've hit balls once in the last 10 years, but I've barely even held golf clubs in my hands since I had kids. And today I was holding a putter, a real crappy putter, but I was holding a putter, and we played this 18 holes of mini golf. And it was fun, and, you know, I left plenty of strokes on the course, but let's just say I was still triumphant. And then we celebrated with some vanilla soft serve ice cream. It was a good day. It was a really good day. And I'm feeling very grateful for my wife, Audrey, and for my daughters, Rosalind and Annabelle. They make my life much better, and I hope to do right by them. I'm also very grateful to all of you who are listening, especially those of you who've been with me for quite some time, following along and, just caring at all that you might. I've said it many times, but this show is a really valuable thing in my life, and I'm just very grateful that anybody's listening to it and engaging in this kind of dialogue. And thank you on my birthday, everybody. Appreciate you. Now, today's podcast with Chase Bossart is really, it's a special podcast for me, everyone. And I don't know if all of you are going to dig it as much as me. I think if you're as much of a yoga philosophy nerd or whatever, or somebody who just really thinks discerningly about different texts and philosophies and is open to different ideas and is basing your viewpoint on your own experience of practice, I think that today's episode is a profound education. And those of you who have had a chance to hang out with me and to study with me some, in particular, those of you who have heard me give my take on the aspects of the history and philosophies of yoga that I feel are pertinent to what I'm doing. If you've heard my spiel on that, some of you listening probably know what I'm talking about. Well, today's talk with Chase was so affirming. It's really at the heart of where my viewpoint comes from, and of all the people I have ever heard do textual analysis of yogic texts, Chase is by far my favorite. You'll hear, I do very little talking, which is unusual, as most of you know. I just let Chase go because I wanted to hear him say the things he was saying. There was a few things he said that I hadn't heard him say before that were super important for me. And I'm just super grateful for Chase for giving me the time and for just being such an authentic practitioner and teacher. So excited for you to hear this talk with Chase today. Before we do, let me say something very quickly to everybody out there who is doing the work of owning or managing a yoga studio and is using Mind Body Online. A lot of you know what I'm going to say because I am often talking about the alternative to Mind Body Online, which is KarmaSoft. KarmaSoft is a complete online yoga studio management solution. It is the software that I used when I had my yoga center in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. The owner of KarmaSoft, Rudy Senecal, has been on the show before. You should go back and listen to the episode because we talk all about the company and how he does business. And he's really an example of something that's important to me. I have a blog post out this month about this, about how you can have a value exchange rather than like an extractive, commodifying, or a manipulative business practice. And Rudy is just somebody who runs his company in a way where you really get to have a relationship, and he's responsive, and KarmaSoft makes everything more efficient and easier to do. All of the online scheduling and payroll and accounting, it's all easier with KarmaSoft. I highly encourage you to go check it out. Go to karmasoftonline.com. Let me also drop my stuff. I am going to be at the Omega Institute next week, June 16th through the 21st, still time. I'm also going to be doing some local gigs here. I'm going to be in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, June 28th, and I'm going to be presenting and recording a live panel discussion at the Lehigh Valley Yoga Festival, July 13th. I'm also going to be at the Feathered Pipe Ranch, August 17th through the 24th. You can find out about all those gigs and more, and all of my stuff at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, I think that's good. I will touch base with you on the other side. There are some exciting things coming that I want to tell you about, but Chase and I get deep into stuff, and so we are going to get straight to it. let's listen to this conversation that I had with Chase Bossart. Hey.
Hello, Jay.
Chase.
How good to hear from you.
You too, man. Do me a favor. Turn off the video so we'll get a better audio signal.
As you wish.
Hi, man. So good to talk to you again. First, I'm sorry. I've been mispronouncing your name, Chase Bossart. I've been mispronouncing it for like a decade. I'm so sorry, man.
That's all right. No worries. It's not that big a deal, but since I knew you were probably going to say my name, I thought I should let you know how I would like it to be said.
I so appreciate that. I actually just feel lame about that because I've known you for a long time, and I should know that. I should know how to pronounce your name right. So
No.
Well, but Chase, you have been on the show before, but you were on a long time ago, over 3 years ago, and you were the 10th episode, and now this is the 170th episode.
Wow.
So lots,
yeah. As I was thinking about what we might talk about today, I was thinking what an amazing thing you've done, Jay. Oh. And to have the continuity and to keep going and to have interesting people come on and to have interesting discussions, and have people tune in and listen to that. And what a service you're doing to yoga as a whole. It's really an amazing thing. Congratulations.
Thanks a lot, man. I really appreciate you saying that. And, it's ironic because I was really feeling like, I remember when I posted your episode, it was when I was still on social media. I am now off of social media, but I remember you being a little bit upset because I tagged everybody and we talked about, you were really open and we talked about some stuff and I felt bad about that. So just to have you say that about the show now, all these years later, I'm glad because I've definitely learned, I was reckless at that time, you know what I mean? I just didn't really think things through about what I was doing. I didn't realize that people were going to be listening. You know what I mean? I was sort of just like on a little bit of a high at the very beginning.
Well, I want to say that I there's nothing I want to take back from that podcast, and I think it was there's nothing that I wouldn't have wanted out there. It was just a little shocking to me too because it was you and I having this nice private conversation and sort of talking, and then all of a sudden, bam! There it is, all out. Everybody can hear everything. And I was like, "Oh, right, okay."
Welcome to podcasting.
So that's how this thing works, right? Yeah, actually, he said that.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking, actually, that I wouldn't have to go in and say like who I am or what I did, et cetera, because we kind of covered that in the last podcast. But I thought if you don't mind, I'll just give a quick minute about like who I am and what I do.
Sure, you can do that. I mean, I would say that is one of the beauties of having another visit because we have done a lot of your bio, but if you feel like you want to give a little recap, sure, I think it's appropriate because I've talked to a number of people in the last few years and I've often cited you and they have different viewpoints and they dispute some things. So it would be good for us. It would be good for us to establish a little bit of context for people who didn't listen to episode 10. So go ahead, give us a little bit of a rundown about where you're coming from. Okay,
so I met Mr. Deshikachar in 1991 on a study abroad program, and it was very, my first introduction to yoga was with him talking about a university course. This is yoga theory. And that led to my getting an MA in religious studies from UC Santa Barbara. David White was on my committee as I wrote my master's thesis about Yogasūtras. And my spending almost 5 years in India as a student of Mr. Deshikachar's over a course of 20 some odd years. That's the basic nutshell. Now I live in San Francisco and I run something called the Yoga Well Institute, which is basically a training institute for yoga therapists and yoga teachers, and we do a lot of philosophy and meditation teaching online.
Cool. I think that's good. And, people can go back and hear the full story of your travels and your studies.
Yes.
And a little bit about that master's thesis, which we do have to talk about again today, I'm afraid. Not I'm afraid. Actually, I'm not afraid of that at all. I'm happy about that.
All right, good. Let's go.
There's nothing to be afraid of. But I think that you are someone who I've known, just for everybody else to know our relationship over the years. I met you at the first time I went to the International Association of Yoga Therapists conference, where they had that Council of Schools meeting. And we met there, and it was actually like a little bit of a contentious, but I was very impressed by you. And then ultimately, I had you come to do sutra readings, and sometimes we had you do Bhagavad Gita, I believe, for people who were in my teacher training for a couple of years at my center in Brooklyn.
Yes,
and
that's true.
And I learned a heck of a lot from those visits. And what stood out to me most is that your readings of those texts were different than all the other readings I had heard, and they resonated with me because I'm inspired by the teachings of Mr. Desikachar. So your study with him and the viewpoint that you have through that, and your readings of the text align with my experience, and that's why I wanted to have you around.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And so since then, Chase, since you and I had our conversation sitting at that center 3 years ago, I've had a number of different Sanskritists on.
Yes.
And, there's a long, and I'm sure you're aware, there's all kinds of new scholarship happening with the Hatha Yoga Project. I have a conversation with Jim Mallinson that people will hear before this one. And, we didn't get into what I want to talk to you about today, but just in general, that there is renewed scholarship and new critical editions being worked on.
Yes.
And
I'm aware of that, and I'm following it. And I have to say that it's a wonderful project. It's really important work. And I think there's some important things to be said that the academic community as a whole needs to be aware of, etc. I did listen to, you had Seth Powell on your podcast a few weeks back. I did listen to that. And that was very interesting. So
because that's what I want. I want to talk to you about Narodaha and what he said.
Good. Yeah. Well, let's do that.
All right. Well, first, before we jump straight to that, let me just set it up a little bit more, and just to say that, in those conversations with those folks, what it's come to boil down to, some in my mind, as a bit of a frame to start here, is that there is these different viewpoints within yoga, and some of them are more transcendent in nature, for lack of another word, and Narodaha tends to mean a stilling or a cessation of the mind. And then there are other viewpoints where it's not so much about this transcendent consciousness, but this more integrated idea where Narodaha means directing the mind, for instance. And what I found is that most of these folks who are doing the scholarship, the scholar practitioner folks, that they say is that the strict translation of the text would say that it's this dualistic thing, and that Mr. Desikachar has put an overlay of interpretation onto the text. And I have pressed them on that very topic when I've spoken to them about this, and they go to the text. And I feel like that maybe relates to what you feel like needs to be said to the academic community, potentially.
Yes, I think you're right. So this is really an interesting question. I'm glad you're bringing it up. I do really want to talk about it. I want to back up a little bit and say that I think that this is part of what makes your podcast really interesting, is that you are exploring everything yoga. And you remember this story of the 5 blind men talking about what is an elephant. And each one has, one says he's holding onto the tusk, and he says, an elephant is like a spear. And this guy next to him who's holding onto the trunk says, no. An elephant is like a snake. And then somebody else is holding on to the leg. No. An elephant is like a tree. The trunk is so strong. And so somebody else is holding on to the tail. No. An elephant is like a dust broom, etc. Okay, so are they wrong? No. Actually, in some regards, each one of them is correct. And I think what is happening in yoga as a whole is what we miss is context. What's missing is context. What's there is practices, and what's missing is the sort of overall, well, what are we doing in this with these practices? Like if you go online to YouTube or something and you Google a technique, you can find literally 5,000 videos about this is how you do that technique. But what is missing is here's why you would do this technique, or here's the kind of person that would do this technique in this sort of situation, etc. And so I think as a whole, what's missing is the context. About 6 months ago, you had a series of students of Mr. Deshikachar on your podcast. And, there was some discussion about did Mr. Deshikachar teach the same thing, or did he teach different people, different things, etc.? And what is this thing that Mr. Deshikachar taught, etc.? And, for me, what I want to say is Mr. Deshikachar taught the same thing to different people in different ways. And what needs to be understood is what is it that we're doing? What is yoga? Because you can look at all the different definitions of yoga. You can say yoga is samadhi. Is that legitimate? Of course. But yoga is also equanimity. It's Bhagavad Gita, 2nd chapter. Yoga is skill in action. It's also Bhagavad Gita, 2nd chapter. Yoga is the separation. Yoga is what separates you from your connection to suffering. Also Bhagavad Gita, 6th chapter. Yoga is the connection of the personal soul with the greater soul. This is Yajnavalkya. Yoga is protection. This is from the Amarakosha, kind of thesaurus. Yoga is upaya, a tool. Yoga is, in other words, yoga is something that helps you to do what you couldn't do before, like touch your toes or say no, something like that. Yoga is dhyanam. Yoga is meditation. Yoga is sangati. Yoga is a connection. There's a bringing together of two things. This often gets translated as union, I prefer, linking. And then the last one of this thesaurus that I'm running off says yoga is yukti, is a kind of adaptive intelligence. Yoga is what allows you to respond to situations in different ways. So, wow, we have all these different definitions of yoga. How do we put them together, and how do we understand what's going on? And that is what is missing in our yoga sort of understanding, is like a context. All of these definitions are correct, and yet they apply in different ways to different situations. So, for instance, I think we can broadly say there are 3 sort of areas of practice. One area is what's called chikitsa. It's therapy. It's the recovery of balance. So I have some sort of problem. I have some sort of dis-ease. It's already happened. My system is not functioning well. We can apply the principles of yoga to recover our balance, to come back out of that disease. Then you can say a second one is rakshana. Yoga is There's a kind of maintenance of our balance. There's a kind of maintenance of our systems operating in a proper way. And I think that a lot of what the yoga practices that are in gyms and studios and whatnot and things are basically in this section. And then there's another set of practices which we would label as, or could be labeled as Shikshana, which means something like the precise pronunciation. So you have a set of practices that achieve extraordinary capacities out of the mind and the body,
or ordinary capacities,
extraordinary capacities, exactly. So the thing is like, well, what are we doing? Well, the principles are the same in each of the three areas, but they manifest in very different ways in each of the three areas. And so then people look at the manifestations, they look at the forms, and they say, oh my, this is really different from that. Oh, well, what was he thinking? Or what was she thinking? Or how did this work? Because the forms are so different. It's actually, no, if we just take the principles and we look and see how they're being applied, then what we can see is it's actually the same thing. It's just being taught in a different way based on where this person is in their practice, or in the way that their mind and body, emotions, etc., are functioning. So I think a lot of the discussions that we end up having are sort of arguments about what's right, when actually what we're talking about is different sections of practice. So the scholarly interpretation of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is very heavily indebted to a kind of Vedantic overview. And if you look at what is the philosophical history of India, the politically most successful one has been Advaita Vedanta from about the 7th century CE on. And today, most scholars and most practitioners are really adherents of Advaita Vedanta. So,
wait a second. Before we go there yet, I want to go back to something else you said, and then I want to go to what you just said, because first you said you were talking about Desikachar, and it was an important point, and you sent me the email. You're like, Desikachar didn't teach different things to different people. That's what I kept saying, that the distinction between different things to different people and teaching the same thing in different ways to different people is an important distinction, especially given all of like the yoga for blank stuff that happens these days.
Right.
I think it's an important thing that it is an encompassing whole yoga, and there isn't different things. It's one thing. So
that's right.
I think that's an important distinction to make, and I appreciate that distinction. I do think in terms of, when we talk about principles, when we look at the principles, I have seen that people will, there's all these different sources, and Seth talked about that too, all these different definitions of yoga, and we have to look at them in their entirety, and I think that's right, like the elephant analogy that you gave. But there are what seems to me to be these differences of opinions, even about the same reference to yoga, different references. And you're pointing to Vedanta, but I know that they would say that if you're looking at the text, not the Vedantic interpretations that may have been predominant as time went on, but that if they're trying to look straight at what Patanjali was writing in his time and in making assertions about that.
Yeah, and what they're primarily doing to do that is what's called the Bhashya, which is the commentary on Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. And there's a interesting idea put forth fairly recently by a guy named Philip Moss, who's a very interesting scholar. And he's basically claiming or making the argument that Patanjali and Vyasa, who is Vyasa basically means an arranger, and Vyasa is the name that's given to the main commentator on Patanjali's yoga. So Philip Maas is arguing that Patanjali and Vyasa are one and the same person, and he's also
arguing. Sorry to jump in, but he's also arguing that there's no time gap. Like I learned from you, there was a gap between the sutras and the commentary, and when I mentioned that to Seth, he said that they're arguing that there wasn't that gap.
Yeah, so that the time gap is an argument that I'm less committed to. But when I read the Bhashya, when I read the commentary, what I see time and again is that the author of the Bhashya has privileged the end result of this process of yoga. So, in other words, in the very first sutra, Atta Yoga Anushasanam, the commentator says, Yogaha samadhihi. Yoga is samadhi. I have no issue with that. It's totally fine. As long as we don't take that to mean yoga is only samadhihi. And this is where it sort of breaks down in the academic presentation of the Yogasūtras, or the interpretation of it. It's a little bit like saying football is touchdowns. Okay, great. Football is touchdowns. You try to prevent the other team from getting one. You try to get as many as you can.
Whoever has the most at the end wins.
Yes. But even samadhi is not the goal. Okay, the goal is this, the goal is this experiential discernment between what is essentially me and what is my container, what is my mind and my body. And one of the tools is samadhi. So there is, and then this is one example of like the prejudice towards the highest experience, so-called in yoga, etc. Another one is at the beginning of the third chapter. The commentator of Vyasa, he basically starts off and says, having described the first 5 steps of sadhana, he will now give the next 3 steps. Okay, so second chapter, Ashtanga Yoga is not the whole sadhana. It's not the whole practice. It's Kriya Yoga, it's Viveka Khyati, and then it's Ashtanga Yoga. So the commentator, when he says the first 5 steps of sadhana have now been presented, he's basically indicating that he's not taking value with Kriya Yoga or Viveka Khyati. So there's lots and lots of examples in the Bhashya where what I would consider to be a bias towards highest experience shows up, and these are just some examples.
And why do you think, and you don't think that that's in the aphorisms, you think that that's someone commentating, and that's why you don't think it's the same person?
Yeah. So when you write a sutra, there's some rules. They're called Tantra Yukti, which just means like the rules for writing a sutra. And different sutras have different rules, okay? But all of them, whatever you say at the beginning cannot be contradicted later. So in other words, they all follow this structure where you start off generally, and then what you say later has to follow and be consistent with that, okay? So it does not make sense to say yoga is only the highest, because there's a whole process by which you get from here to there. And that process is also yoga. How do we know that? Well, second chapter, he says, tapas, swadhyaya, ishvara pranidhana, kriya yoga. This is yoga in action. If we only have yoga as samadhi, what are we doing with tapas, swadhyaya, and ishvara pranidhana? How do those things relate to yoga with samadhi? So you cannot say that yoga is only samadhi. Then another example is Ashtanga Yoga. right? Patanjali uses, this is also second chapter, number.
That's the Patañjali path.
30. Yeah. Yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. Wait, yoga is only samadhi? Well, then why does he say there's 8 parts of yoga? Not consistent. Doesn't make sense. So, when I listened to the podcast with Seth, who by the way, like I said, it was really, I was quite touched by his story. He's obviously a very sincere practitioner, a knowledgeable guy, smart guy. When I listened to that, he's so clear. The last 1,500 years of yoga has been dominated by a kind of Vedantin overlay, and what we need to do is sort of understand the background of what is yoga, Bhagavad Gita, Samkhya, some of the Buddhist texts and stuff. I agree with all of that completely, and yet the conclusion is that yoga is only in this highest, and only this highest meditation, forgetting that Arjuna had these amazing realizations, oneness of the whole universe in God, et cetera, et cetera. And then what is the message of the Bhagavad Gita? Go fight the war.
Wait. We can't jump to Bhagavad Gita yet. We have to stay on sutras because I want to go to Bhagavad Gita next. Because first, we still have these issues of pure translation, though, right?
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. I'm not saying he's wrong. Okay, I'm not saying he's wrong. I don't
think anybody has to be wrong.
Mm-hmm. It's a limited, narrow focus.
Okay. Well, let's get specific then, though, because, for instance, to me and all the people that I've talked to, when it comes to sutras and it comes to understanding yoga in a way that resonates with me or seems to part ways from my resonance, it does all hinge on the word nirodha.
Yes.
And I know that was what your thesis was on, and you said something when you were on here 3 years ago about that, and I asked every other person who translates Sanskrit about it since, and they've all refuted what you've said. That Nirodha, and I just want to repeat right here. I want to repeat right here exactly what Seth said. He said that the root of the word Nirodha is root, and that, or I don't know how to pronounce it right, but that it means to obstruct or to stop or to put an end to. And he also referred to a synonym that's referred to later, which I believe was virama, which means to stop. And he said basically that there was no disputing that.
Yeah. So again, this is a very selective argument, okay? So yogaha chitta vritti nirodha. This is Patanjali's definition of yoga. So one of the things that we need to understand is that the Yoga Sutra is a dictionary defining terms. So Patanjali knew the word samadhi. He could have defined yoga is samadhi. But he doesn't. He says yogaha chitta vritti nirodha. Okay, so now we're going to have an idea. What is chitta? What is vritti? What is nirodha? Chitta is a very common word in the Indian language. It means the mind. So essentially, he doesn't define that. Vritti is also a common word in the English language, but it's so common that you have to know kind of what you're talking about. So many people translate vritti as, chitta, vritti, nirodha. They translate it as the cessation of the fluctuations of mind. But Patanjali defines vritti 3 sutras later. He says there are 5 vrittis, and they are perception, understanding, correct and incorrect, imagination, or some will say language, dreamless sleep, and we'll say memory for lack of an easier term. Okay, so the 5 vrittis of the mind are Perception, understanding, correctly and wrong and incorrectly, those are 2. Imagination or language, that's the 3rd. Off, and memory. So to actually translate chitta vritti nirodha as the cessation of the fluctuations of mind is to ignore Patanjali's own definition of the word vritti 3 sutras later. Okay? Now, is that unheard of? No. I mean, you can do that. Sure. Fine. But the point is that in that case, it doesn't really mean fluctuations. Now, many people will say that cessation of the movements or the modifications of mind is the definition of yoga. Am I right? You want to?
No, that is generally what they said. But again, it still comes down to nirodha and whether or not rud means to obstruct.
It doesn't work. A definition has to work all the time, or it's not a good definition. So if we're going to say that yoga is the cessation of the modifications of mind, or that yoga is the stilling of the mind, etc. Last night, about 2:00 in the morning, I was practicing yoga. No, I wasn't.
Well, but they would say that's sleep. That's not the same stilling of the fluctuations.
Okay. So Patanjali actually defines deep sleep in the first chapter, number 10. He says it's the absence of pratyaya. There is an absence of activity of the mind. Okay? So we can't say that yoga is stillness if we mean that it's the absence of activity. We can say that yoga is stillness if what we mean is that the movement of the activities of the mind from object to object to object to object has stopped, and they're resting now only on one object. Okay? So
stillness doesn't necessarily mean nothing. It means resting on one object.
It means remaining with one object. Where a lot of these definitions and things come back to also is the root of the word yoga is yuj. Yuj is a yoke. Yokes are often anybody who's worked on a farm, when you want to unite 2 horses, you don't use a yoke. When you have 2 cows and you want a third, don't put them in a yoke. You won't get you won't get a third cow. What is a yoke? A yoke is a methodology of control. A yoke is something that allows you to direct the movements of something you would otherwise not be able to direct. So I put my horses in a yoke, and now I can get my chariot drawn to the place where I want it to be drawn. It's not about union.
About being able to steer the ship.
It's about being able to direct the ship, the horses. Yoga, when we're related to the mind, is about learning how to direct the activities of the mind. This is a universal application. It applies to asana. It applies to pranayama. It applies to my relationships. It applies to meditation. It also applies to the highest level. Okay? So the question is, can we get there with the use of the word nirodha, right? Because nirodha, all this stuff hinges on what is the meaning of nirodha. So if you say that the synonym of nirodha is virama, again, you're selectively choosing sutras that are related only to the highest possible experience. So virama is coming from the first chapter, number 18. He says, virama pratyaya abhyasa purvaha samskara sheshaha anyaha. Okay? This does not even use the word Nirodha. It's just saying when the activities of the mind are very quiet, some will say stopped, that's fine. Memory is still present. Okay, this is basically what this sutra says. It is related to the highest, to samadhi. There's no doubt about it. However, if you look at the wording of the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali actually uses the word Nirodha in many places.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.